Tansi kita tamiskad no kakino. We pe mau pe chiku mau ta Saskatoon. I used a language conference. Kai speak skuyago ma on November 26, 27, 2014. How mitaki api. I'd like to invite you all to this conference on November 26th and 27th to preserve our First Nation languages. I'm a student, I'm still learning. We never stop learning, and I come from two different cultures, so I'm really challenged to learn both languages of my mother and my father. And I think these languages are very important. I know, there we go. I know they're very important for our cultural identification as people. It is the essence of who we are as Cree people or as Nakota people. I know how important it is to, especially in our ceremonial aspect too, as well, in our Cree ceremonies and in our Nakota ceremonies as well. It's very important. I think when we talk to our Creator, He seems to be more pleased when we use the languages we were born with. And I also, to me, language preservation is important because we do have a lot of international people coming to Canada from all over the world, and they preserve their languages. So I kind of feel sometimes when I'm sitting somewhere, say for example, talking to my wife, we should be talking in our own language as well, instead of just speaking English. So it's challenging to learn learn both languages. I know that I know Cree more than the Nakota language, and I know that from my experience with Cree only. You never stop learning the language. There's always new words, and there's different dialects and different phrases and all these different dialects and words that, you just never stop learning. And I know it's the same way for even both the Dakota and Nakota language. They're very similar, but yet they're so far apart. I know our Swampy Cree language, the N dialect language, is very close to what they call Anishinaabe or Ojibwe, and I know that a lot of the words are pretty well the same, but sometimes I notice that there is some variation in it as well too. So I guess because knowing the Swampy Cree language, I also kind of understand the Saulteaux or Anishinaabe language. I know I grew up with some of the Anishinaabe people and got to learn quite a bit of their language as well. So. And that's, I guess in reality, is I like to try and learn all the languages, especially on the prairies. I know one of the biggest challenges, at least I know how to greet in Dene, and just saying how are you, and maybe a few little words here and there. And so even Dene is another language I'm kind of fascinated with. I wish I could speak, very fluently in all these languages. I think they're very important because my grandfather told me, he said a long time ago, it was nothing for our people to speak 4 or 5 languages, and then they also had the sign language, the hand sign language, and I always remember that. And I'm very sorry I never learned sign language from him. And and I, with the Nakota, I knew he was a fluent speaker, and I never really grew up with him till I was a teenager, and it was very hard for me to begin to comprehend the Nakota language, for example. I find Dakota language, I seem to be, I hang around with a lot of people or have a lot of friends who are Dakota, and my grandmother being Dakota, of course, I always wanted to learn, so they teach me Dakota, and I seem to catch on a lot easier with Dakota than Nakota. I don't hear the language spoken as much anymore, but I hear a lot of Cree, and it's not only Swampy Cree. I've been off my reserve since I was 13, so there's a lot of Cree that I'm picking up from various dialects and communities, and it's like I said, we never stop learning those languages. So I guess for me, I know immersion is very important. I think once you get immersed in a community that speaks the language, then it's very easy to pick up that language, and I think that's kind of would be a way for us to learn our language, is to immerse ourselves where there's Cree speakers, Dene speakers, or Nakota speakers, in order to really get a grasp of the language. I know I'm being challenged here by speaking publicly. I can understand what they're saying in Cree, but it's a challenge for me to actually, I got to get into it to try and speak it, because one of the unfortunate things is that we constantly speak English, and we don't practice speaking our own languages with each other enough as we should in order to maintain it. And I really I was originally born in Manitoba, raised in northern Manitoba in a community called Norway House, where they spoke Swampy Cree. And moving out, we learned a little bit of Ojibwe, Dakota, which is my mother's language, my grandmother's language, and Nakota, a bit of it. And but so just there's a lot to learn, and you'll never stop learning. And it's like, for me, to be holistic or to be complete for me is I gotta understand both languages. So it is a bit of a challenge to speak it if you don't speak it enough, or you're constantly speaking English. I think we got to sort of pull down those barriers, and then, then again, sometimes you get too shy, especially if there's elders or people that speak better than you, or sometimes you don't want to speak it because you're always afraid to make mistakes. But I think those are things you have to overcome personally. And I really enjoy learning the different languages. I wish I could be immersed or go to places where you can be totally immersed in those languages, so you can pick it up pretty quickly. And I think when you put your mind to it, you can learn how to pick up any kind of language, even throughout internationally as well. But yeah, language is very important. Like, it's the essence of the culture. It's very important to learn in order to understand some of especially our ceremonials and how things really originated, our creation stories, those sorts of things, to really understand and be able to tell them in the language, I think is really critical. So we have all sorts of teachings to pass on to our children in the language. I know there's so many teachings that once you open that door, it's just amazing. It's really fascinating what's out there, and it comes through the language. And I have a grandson who's one of my grandsons who's learning how to speak from his grandmother, who was a fluent Cree speaker. So I get really amazed that he picks it up just like a duck to water. And I know children are very I know that if they were raised with Cree speakers, they would probably be speaking Cree. I experienced that as a child. I know my mother didn't speak Cree, but certainly my father, my cousins, my grandfather, grandmother, they all spoke Cree. So, it was just totally immersed. Because I can't remember when I started learning, the Cree language. I was probably pretty small, but now I'm getting up in age, and I hear so much Cree from different dialects, and like I said, different communities, that it seems like maybe my vocabulary is getting bigger, but I just need to know how to learn how to public speak, and it comes through practice. I know if you speak English too much and you want to say Cree words, sometimes your tongue can't pronounce those words right, and you sound, you don't want to. Sometimes you don't want to say it because you get tongue-tied or something, because you're not used to speaking in that language and saying those words every day. So you do get tongue-tied at times, and it's just a matter of just overcoming that. Like I said earlier, that shyness. I know that's one of the difficult things to overcome, because I did experience that as a kid too. Learning the language is that. You sometimes get kind of reluctant to say things, even though you know it, or you know what they're talking about. And when it comes to your turn, you don't want to say anything but that's something we have to overcome, or we got to remind ourselves too, if you're a speaker, not to tease other people, because I think right now we're at a critical stage. We don't want our languages to disappear. I know that the Nakota language is really suffering because of the lack of speakers. There is still quite a number of Dakota speakers. There's still quite a number of Cree speakers on the different communities, both in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, of course Alberta as well. Yeah, one of the things I guess I gotta remind maybe even my home community is everybody spoke Cree in that community when I grew up in the 60s, 70s, early 70s. And if you go back today, there's a lot of people, their children now speak English, and even though both parents are fluent speakers, there should be no reason why the children should be fluent Cree speakers. But we have to look at language preservation. We cannot let our children constantly speak English. I know it's an international language, considered an international language now, but I think within our family settings and our family groups, we really need to learn and practice our languages. Our children need to speak it. I know my son keeps getting after me for not teaching him what I knew in terms of the language. He reminds me of that every so often, and he too is kind of a multilingual. He has bits and pieces of languages from his relatives, his grandparents and great-grandfathers and stuff like that. So I'm kind of like that, I guess, as I'm not just one where, some of us have, like I was saying earlier, more than one language to learn. And I think the more languages we learn, like going back to what my grandfather said, I think we'd be way better off if we went and visit, say for example, the Siksika Nation, and we were able to speak their language. I'm sure they would really be receptive and honor you for speaking their language. I've experienced a bit of that with some of the Anishinaabe people or the Nakota people because I grew up with some of them in southern Manitoba and kind of caught on to their language, and I surprised them when I started talking the Nakota or Anishinaabe language to them because they didn't think I knew it. And I was just doing, with the old guys, and it just opened doorways. Just like opening a door, is they became more receptive and really respected you for trying to, speak in their language. And the same thing happens with I found that even with the Dene, even just the greeting with them, greeting them, they again to really get more receptive to you because they know you're wanting to learn their language and they really appreciate and share. The sharing then again opens the door as well. They begin to share more than you would really expect in some cases, I suppose. Yeah. So it's language is very important, I think, and like I said, we got to maintain it and bring it back again. And I know there's various dimensions of languages in the various nations as well. I know with my father's language, they have High Cree and Low Cree, and I remember sitting with my grandfather and my father talking, and they went into that other language, the Higher Cree, and I was just they kind of left me behind. But I wish I could have learned it, sat with them, and learned more of that. But you have to live in, like I said, immersion and total immersion in your communities to really grasp everything, I suppose. And then when I go to my mother's side, there I have a female and male language with dialects and everything. I mean, female dialect and male dialect. And it's gender different. And there's a difference in the gender there with male and female. And sometimes you got to be careful what you say because may talk like a woman or you may talk like a man depending on the phrases you use in that language. So, and then they told me there was a child language, a children's language as well. So in that particular language group, and I know there's reference to some stories about how some different children moved away from the camp when they were small with the old people, and the old people died off, but the children remained, and they continued to speak their child language into adulthood. And the main group went back and found them, the children or the adults now, and they all still spoke like children. And so there's an example that there was differences even for children. So it gets pretty complicated in some cases, but I think it's